Now from Fox, and I do want to get back to this breaking news involving the war between Israel and Hamas, as we learned a short time ago that the Israel Air Force is saying it intercepted a surface-to-surface missile in the area of the Red Sea. This is the first operational interception by the aerial defense system since the start of that war earlier this month. An additional aerial threat successfully intercepted by Israeli Air Force fighter jets in the area this morning. Again, all of this information coming in moments ago from the Israel Defense Forces. I want to talk about all of this and more, so let's bring in Avi Melamed, a former Israeli intelligence official, former senior Israeli official on Arab affairs, and founder of Inside the Middle East Institute. He does join us now live to once again discuss all of this. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here this morning.
Hello, Josh. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, can you kind of explain to me and break down this breaking news that we did just learn from the Israel Defense Forces once again saying that they have intercepted a surface-to-surface missile near the Red Sea? Can you break down exactly what that means and the significance of it?
So those missiles were launched by the Houthis in Yemen. Houthis are a Shiite congregation tribes located in Yemen. They are massively backed by the Iranians. The missiles launched by the Houthis are actually made in Iran. These are all guided by the Iranian regime. So this is one very significant aspect because it means that Iran is now raising the level of its intimidation vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the United States in America as part of the Iranian tactic to try and to thwart American intervention and to try and to stop the Israeli attack against Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So this is one significant aspect. The other significant aspect is the successful operational aspect of the interception. It was intercepted by the Arrow missile system, Israeli Arrow defense system. Actually, it's the second time basically that system has been applied successfully. A couple of years ago, it was applied against challenge that missile that was launched from Syria. So these are the two most significant aspects of that story today, particularly the fact that the Iranians are sending a message. They are raising, sort of speaking, the stakes.
Yeah, and we're going to continue to follow that, of course, and bring updates as we do get them. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other developments. And one of the big developments over the last 24 hours is the rescue of that 19-year-old Israeli soldier captured during the October 7th attack. I want to get your initial thoughts when you heard about the rescue, and do we know exactly how she was found?
Well, one of the things that I said early and from the very beginning, the face of this whole thing was that we have to pay attention to the fact that when those citizens, Israeli civilians, kids, women, old people were kidnapped into Gaza Strip, they were basically kidnapped by a strange combination of Hamas militants and terrorists and then other mobs that basically joined them. So people were basically grabbing, sort of speaking, just anything they could, like, you know, kids or women or whatever. And one of the things that I said was that I think that Hamas, I'm not so sure that Hamas controls all of the hostages. I don't know if he knows where all the hostages are and who exactly hold them. Obviously, Hamas holds most of them, but it may be that some other individuals actually from Gaza are holding those hostages. And one of the things that I said was that the more Israel will be present on the ground, the more it will have ability to extract more intelligence and information about the whereabouts of the hostages, and it have a better ability to basically try and to rescue some of the hostages. I think that what we saw last night, or to be more accurate before that, is to a certain extent what I was talking about, meaning it may be possible that this specific soldier that was released was captured by some individuals, and there was ability of the Israeli intelligence and the forces on the ground to get to her and actually to release her.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll learn more about that in the coming days, I would imagine. Now, there are still more than 200 hostages that are being held by Hamas. So how does Israel go about rescuing them or successfully calling for their release?
I think that Israel is applying a parallel trajectory policy. Israel is fighting this war as if there are no hostages, and at the same time, Israel is negotiating for the release of the hostages as if there is no war. And I think that Israel is doing that in a both parallel trajectory, and we can see that happening on the ground. And again, one of the things that the military ground operation provides Israel with is an increasing intelligence that could be maybe more helpful to Israel in order to get more information about the whereabouts of the hostages, and accordingly to increase the pressure on Hamas to release them.
We know, of course, that the Israeli airstrikes are ongoing, as they have been for weeks at this point. Now, we also know that we've seen troops moving closer and closer inward into Gaza. Is this the ground invasion that we've been hearing about for several weeks, or is this more of a smaller scale operation that will eventually lead to that ground invasion?
Up until a couple of hours ago, I think that we have been witnessing a sort of like an interim phase between the first one and the large ground operation. I think that right now, a couple of hours ago, to the best of my understanding, this ground operation was significantly expanded and extended. The Israeli commander of the Israeli Southern Command published a formal statement to all the forces in the ground to move to their assignments and their missions. And reports coming in from my sources in Gaza Strip and elsewhere are basically indicating that there is a significant increasing on the Israeli ground operation from different directions towards the area of Gaza City. So I think that we could say quite cautiously, but I think it will be accurately to say at this point that we are actually witnessing this massive expansion of the Israeli ground operation.
The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu still rejecting calls for a ceasefire, making that very clear during his speech yesterday. Do you think his mind can be changed? Or, we know the United Nations and other countries have essentially said there should be a ceasefire. Do you think his mind is going to be changed, or will he stand firm there?
Look, at this point, it seems like he's very firm. There is a consensus in Israel wall to wall that the situation in Gaza Strip must be profoundly changed. We cannot simply go back to the situation as it was in Gaza Strip. That's the reason why Israel initiated this war, to actually end Hamas' role and rule as a destructive player in the region. And there is a consensus from wall to wall in Israel. The issue of the hostages obviously presents a very significant and delicate task. It may require some tactical maneuvers. It may require for some sort of like arrangements on the ground. But in the end of the day, I think that from an Israeli perspective, meaning both the governmental policymakers' perspective, the military establishment, and I would say most significantly, Israeli public opinion, there is this consensus, there is this wall-to-wall consensus, and I don't think this consensus is going to be changed or cracked.
As I mentioned, we did hear from Netanyahu just yesterday. We played a portion of that speech for you about 10 minutes ago here on LiveNOW from Fox. Anything that stood out to you in what he had to say? Any comments that maybe you weren't expecting, or just something that you want to highlight?
Well, I think that the thing I would like to highlight was Netanyahu's message to the world, actually saying, look, it's not only Israel's war, it's actually, we are fighting you, the free world war. And to a large extent, I can understand it. The mask of Hamas was totally taken off on October 7th. I know that there are still people in the world that think that Hamas is some sort of like freedom fighters, but Hamas is actually the twin brother of ISIS. And it was clearly revealed on October 7th. Hamas, we have to remember, Hamas is not confining its vision nor its operation to the territory of Gaza or the West Bank or the Middle East. Hamas is expanding its activities and ideology and infrastructure worldwide. I think that the international community should be aware of that and understand that. And I think that's what was beyond Netanyahu's statement, where he actually says it's not only Israel's war, it's the war of the free world against an enemy that is presenting a very severe threat to the world.
And we've heard from Netanyahu as well as the Israel Defense Forces. They have said we're, quote, moving into the next phase of this war. Now, you touched on it already, but what exactly is meant by next phase, as they said?
Look, it's a long-term process. It's not something that is going to be overdone and overnight. It's a very difficult situation. It's a war that takes place in a massively urban areas. Hamas has been building this huge network of tunnels under the ground in Gaza Strip. He has been booby-trapping facilities, buildings, mosques, and so on and so on. Lots of IEDs, snipers, anti-tank units, and other things. So we are looking at a very challenging combat environment. So we have to move according to some kind of like a very structured, very well designated and designed Israeli military plan. And to the best of my understanding, as of now, this is exactly what the Israeli army is doing. We have to remember, Israel has been, to a large extent, preparing for that scenario for a relatively long period of time. And up until now, to the best of my understanding, the Israeli plan is moving ahead accordingly as it was planned. But we all understand this is a bitter fight inside Gaza Strip. We are fighting against bitter enemy, well armed, who is fortifying himself inside buildings and under the ground, and taking advantage of every possible location that he can. And not less important, trying to use the Gaza people themselves as his own human shield, which obviously is adding to the complexity of the challenge. So when we are talking about next phase, I think that there are multi-phases project. It's not one and done. It's multi-phases project or process that Israel is moving accordingly. Each phase has its own objective. And it's basically, in the end of the day, some sort of like a big puzzle that in the end of the day is supposed to provide Israel with the final objective, and this is to topple down Hamas rule in Gaza Strip and actually to make Hamas irrelevant player. It's not about necessarily hunting down Hamas people to the last one or, demolishing the last rocket of Hamas. It's about basically crushing Hamas as a ruling and an operational and military organization in Gaza Strip, crushing these capacities, and by doing that, basically making Hamas an irrelevant player and unable to continue and to dictate its radical agenda and the Iranian radical agenda, because Hamas is very much tied to the Iranian regime and act as proxy of the Iranian regime.
And right here, we are taking a live look over in D.C. as any moment now we're expecting a hearing that will go deeper into probing the U.S. funding provided to Gaza. What questions do you have that you hope could possibly be answered by U.S. officials? We're going to hear from Blinken. We're going to hear from Austin. What questions do you have that you think could potentially be answered, or you hope will at least be asked?
Well, I think that obviously the major issue is we are all concerned about the humanitarian condition in Gaza. We have to be able to provide answers to hundreds of thousands of Gaza people, innocent people that are not involved in the fight. You know, Israel has been time and time again asked the Gaza people to move to a safe area, to safe zone that is located south to Gaza City, in the southern part of Gaza Strip. And in this specific zone, the people could get everything they need, at least for the time being, because obviously they have to move away from their homes because it's a very risky environment to stay here. So I would expect, of course, that the question will deal about the issues like of how do you secure the provision of those Gaza people that are moving to these safe places? What kind of arrangements are being done? What kind of, the quantities that are required to do that? How is it going to be involved? Is it going to be involving a cooperation of other players in the region, like Egypt, like the Saudis, like United Arab Emirates or Qatar? I mean, there should be some questions that has to be, I think, comes along with that. And by the way, talking about the whole issue of the financial aspect of that, which is something very significant in the end of the day, here is something that I want to bring to the attention of the audiences. Qatar, who is playing the role of the mediator and goes between, Qatar at the same time is also hosting Hamas leaders. And the Qataris are playing on both sides of their mouth, which is fine. This is legitimate. It's a real politic. But I want to say something about Qatar as a for thought, sort of speaking. Qatar spent $250 billion preparing the Mondial that was in Qatar. $250 billion. Qatar doesn't have problem of cash and money. Maybe this is something we have to think about when we are thinking about who exactly is going to pay and the burden of the financial burden that involves in supporting the people of Gaza and preventing humanitarian crisis.
All right, Avi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break all of this down. I've said it time and time again, but there is a lot to this and pretty much developments that are happening on an hourly basis at this point. So thank you again for taking the time to be here. Is there anything else that you want to add before I let you go?
I just want to add one last thing. I mean, what we saw, we started that in our interview. We talked about the shooting of missiles by the Houthis in Yemen. They are located 1,000 miles away from Israel. So this is significant because I've been talking constantly about this axis of evil that the Iranian has been building across the Middle East, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza Strip. This is an example of how dangerous this Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is activating its proxies, is basically responsible for death and destruction across the Middle East. We just have yet another example of how significant and harmful the impact of this Iranian regime hegemonic vision is. One example that we have is the whole issue of the missiles and the drones that are all basically developed in Iran. The Houthis did not come up and develop those missiles. They came from Iran. The same applies as for the drones. So it goes back to the international community who has been dealing for a long period of time with the Iranian threat, mostly focusing on the story of the nuclear program. Now I think that the international community, not less than that, should be also engaged in standing firmly and blocking the Iranian regime hegemonic vision and its different components in different parts, meaning its armies of terror and proxies, its drones and missiles program, and of course, its nuclear program. Just think about the possible situation where we witness such a regional crisis right now when we see in the Middle East, where the Iranian regime is basically steering and fueling all this violence. Just think for a minute about the possibility or the scenario that the Iranian regime would have done that with a nuclear weapon in its possession.
All right, Avi Melamed, former Israeli intelligence official, former senior Israeli official on Arab affairs, and founder of Inside the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and provide your expertise. We appreciate it.
Of course, Josh. Thank you for having me.